Geoff Huston is the chief scientist at the APNIC, Asia Pacific Network Information Center, where he undertakes research on topics associated with internet infrastructure, IP technologies, and address distribution policies. So with that, and the session is going to be really interesting. I know Angelique spoke about it a little bit in the beginning, so stay tuned for this. Geoff, welcome to the show. Just you're still waking up? Thank you so much. I know it's really early for you there.
It is dark outside. That's true. Look, thank you very much for that. And it's really a pleasure to be here. The state of the internet is such an astonishingly big topic. You know, there's so much that we could talk about. How are we going with IPv6? Is the DNS still managing to do its job, or is it sinking under the strain? What about routing? Does routing even work anymore? And all this pressure with content distribution networks. What's actually happened to the shape of the network? What's the state of transit? Does anyone care anymore? Or has the entire internet been privatized by the CDNs? Who's building infrastructure? Who's left building infrastructure? So many things. But, you know, what I've heard so far has actually been operations. And it strikes me that operations is largely reactive. It's sort of, this event is happening, I need to form a response. But the underlying this system is, why is it happening? How can it happen? Why is the internet so insecure that attacks are easy and defense is hard? How do we manage to make this so asymmetric? And if you go one step further in that how and why, you start to wonder about, what's the state of the technology itself? Are all the preconceptions, rules of thumb, all the decisions that even vendors make before it gets into operations necessarily reflective of what we really know, or is it just some mythology from 30 years ago? So I'd like to drill down on that very fundamental question: what do we know? And more importantly, what's changing and why? Because the internet is not chiseled in granite. We didn't have our best ideas in 1980 and then, you know, stop everything. We still have really good ideas, and things are changing. Things are changing quite radically. It's just sometimes it's not visible. Yes, it's pretty obvious that CDNs and CDN providers are massive. But I'd like to look at one particular area which is quite esoteric, but fundamentally really important, the heart of the internet. I'd actually like to look at protocols. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about evolution. And this sort of verb, I think, entered civilization and our discourse way back, 160 odd years ago. Charles Darwin published what was at the time a surprising book. Originally did a paper authored with Alfred Wallace, where they discovered the same thing independently around the process of, we call it survival of the fittest, but it's the process of evolution of biological life. It's the way life forms adapt to their environment. And what, of course, happens is this is natural selection, as he termed it. That what happens is things evolve because small changes advantage the entity that's changed relative to the rest of the species. And that relative advantage becomes prevalent. Next slide, please. So let's look at the pressures that are sitting inside the internet itself. In the 1980s, the internet we built was a kilobit network, clearly. We managed to make that into a megabit network, starting with the NSFnet and moving on in the 1990s. And the 2000s, we moved to a gigabit network. And then in the 2010s, we kind of stopped. Next slide. What happened? I'm like, it hasn't got much faster in the last 10 years. We haven't gone from gigabits to terabits. We really, really haven't. TCP itself isn't much faster. Next slide. You see, the optical guys didn't see that same sort of ceiling. What's going on in optical is we're now doing terabit capacity optical systems. We're heading way, way up in terms of what we can put across a cable, but the silicon isn't keeping up. Our switching speeds are actually not managing to keep pace with the underlying photons. Why not? Next slide. I'm going to do the next slide a lot. There are a lot of slides here. If we really want to understand why TCP isn't keeping up, we actually need to understand TCP itself. And if there's one protocol, just one, that I reckon is the internet, because all the rest is wrapping. You could have wrapped it around DECnet, Apple Talk. Not sure about SNA. And in fact, I'm not even sure about Apple Talk. You could have wrapped it around anything. But the beating heart of what makes the internet so phenomenally unique, so different, is indeed this TCP protocol. Because TCP protocol was one of those things that has self-adaptation, and it attempts to operate fairly and efficiently. Next slide. Now, fair and efficient are actually really, really big terms. Efficient actually means don't ever leave the ISP with bandwidth. Nothing is left on the table. If you're efficient, you go as fast as the network will let you, as fast as the clock will let you. So operators who go, yes, we operate 75%, we leave 25% for headroom. Not true. Not if TCP is doing its job, because there should be no headroom left. If you're efficient, use everything. Now, the other part of this is fair. Unfortunately, the internet wasn't built for me. Well, maybe it was. No, it wasn't, unfortunately. I have to share the road. I have to share the internet. And I have to share it fairly. I shouldn't crowd out everyone else. If there are 1,000 other people on the wire that I'm on, I should get around 1,000th of the share of that wire. That's fair. So when I'm trying to be efficient, I shouldn't kill everyone else in the process. I should even my pressure out. Next slide. So those are the design objectives. This is a flow control system. It's sort of fluid dynamics in a digital sense. Every single digital flow has to gently push all the other flows out of the way to signal that it needs a fair share, but not too far that it pushes them off the wire completely. That's the ideal situation. Next slide, please. So the way TCP actually works is it doesn't understand what the network's doing, and it doesn't assume that anything the network tells it is necessarily true. All those sort of feedback signals from the network might just be false. It might be someone else mimicking it. I have no idea. So I want to rely on signals I can trust. And the best signal I can trust is actually the echo of me. And the way TCP does the echo of me is that every time you send a data packet across the network, back comes an acknowledgement packet. And the pace of the acknowledgement packets, those ACK packets, is actually the same as the pace of the data packets as they're delivered at the receiver. So as long as I send a packet for every ACK, then I'm keeping pace, a constant pace, because in essence, every time a packet leaves the network, I can inject a packet into the network. Next slide. Now, the issue is, what point is that steady state achieved? What's fast enough? And so we don't know. TCP doesn't know. There's no rationing going on. This is not a circuit-controlled system. We're not running 64K anymore. I need to probe into available capacity to figure out when I'm too fast. And a little under too fast is fast enough. And so the way we originally thought about this in the 1980s, and it is a long time ago, was that when you drop a packet, that's too fast. Next slide. So this is the classic TCP protocol called TCP Reno. While there's no packet drop, gently lift up the pressure on the network. One new packet inside this conveyor belt every round trip time interval. If there's no packet, if there is packet loss, react like crazy. The car has crashed. Decrease the sending rate dramatically. Drop it by 50% to halve the sender's window. Next slide. So what we get out of this is the classic TCP sawtooth picture. That rate halving is actually incredibly important, because what goes on is that as you're increasing the pressure on the network, queues are forming. And as queues form, the queue gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Till eventually, of course, the queue fills and a packet drop occurs. When you rate halve, you actually go silent for one round trip time. And what you want is the queue to drain completely in that round trip time, so that when you start again at half the rate, the queue is empty and you can do it all over again. So this is the classic sawtooth response of TCP. Next slide. So the theory is that if you're memory sized inside the network, what the operator's doing in the network matches what the sender protocol is doing over in the host, you can actually make this queue behavior precisely aligned. So how big should the memory inside the network be? How big should those buffers be? Well, interestingly, it should be the size of the delay bandwidth product. So if you're driving a gigabit link over a 1 second delay, you actually need a gigabit of memory, really fast memory in your line card to make all this work. The queue size is the delay bandwidth product of the link it drives. That's the rule of thumb that vendors have been building to for the last, 30 odd years. Next slide. Now, all this works with the single assumption that it's just me. And as we'll see, that's probably a bad assumption. It's not a one flow network. It's a billion flow network. And all of a sudden things are different. Next slide. So this is what I've said. The size inside your network, what you provision, is bandwidth times round trip time. And that was a result published in 1994. Don't forget, by the way, this is the most expensive memory almost on the planet, because what you need inside these line cards is not slow memory, not memory coming off, the normal production lines. You need memory that is as fast as you can possibly make it. Because if you're trying to go at a gigabit speed, you actually need memory that can give you gigahertz bandwidth. And that is not easy. Next slide. So if you make it too big, what happens? If you overachieve and stuff in way too much memory, oddly enough, all Reno will do is do the same thing, but leave queue bandwidth on the table. It won't drain completely. So that if your queue is too large, you're just inducing delay, which of course is not exactly user-friendly. Next slide. And what if it's too small? Well, maybe too small is an even worse sin, because when it's too small, you actually overachieve. And when you rate halve, you go below link capacity. And so it takes some time to ramp up again. You're leaving bandwidth on the table, and that's inefficient. Next slide. So what we'd like to do is change things. And at this point, Darwinism takes over, because I can't change the bits in the TCP header. That's invariant. But what I can change is my behavior as a sender. And the real question is, can I alter that algorithm to actually be no less aggressive than everyone else? I want my fair share, but maybe eke out corners of bandwidth and capacity that other folk aren't doing. Maybe I should be a little bit more responsive, react faster. What I can't do is destroy the environment. I can't eat up all the bandwidth because everyone else dies and then they're going to come back and kill me. So in some ways, this is almost like a survival Darwinism issue. I need to be just a little bit better than everyone else if I'm going to take advantage of the situation and thrive. So this is what's been happening for some time. Very few folk use Reno now. Next slide. We've done all kinds of theories. There's been a zillion PhDs on the topic, and some of the ideas are quite unique. One of them, which I kind of liked, was, well, if I get 1/1000th of the share of the bandwidth by using Reno, why don't I multiply all my factors by 2? Instead of rate halve, I rate quarter. Instead of increasing by 1 segment every RTT, I increase by 2. I behave as if I'm 2 sessions. Well, 3, 10, 1,000. Why don't I oscillate at a very high frequency? Mul TCP is the way that algorithm works. And in limited applications, it's actually not bad. But overall, you tend to consume the network, destroy the environment, and everyone's unhappy with you. So are there other methods? That linear increase, for example. Next slide. What if we explore mathematics and use a polynomial equation like, a cubic? And interestingly, what you do in a cubic equation is move very quickly to what you think is the sweet spot, and then oscillate more slowly around that spot of packet loss. And if there is, if you will, available headroom, again, you move very quickly to occupy it. Next slide. Now, the sawtooth pattern of Reno is changed in cubic to almost a polynomial shaped pattern. But what you actually find is that it tends to oscillate around packet drop. And what that means is the queues are always full. The bigger the queue, the longer the delay. So in this case, what's going on is that the queuing factor inside the routers is actually decreasing performance, not increasing it. That's bad. Next slide. So Cubic can react extremely quickly, faster than Reno. It's adapted in that sense. But in some ways, it's slow in terms of it's putting packets inside buffers and it takes time to drain them. So it exacerbates buffer bloat. That's bad. Next slide. The real problem is in all of this, it's not one flow. And all of the work so far in terms of flow control has actually been about a single flow. And the idea is, well, if it works for one, it'll work for a billion. Not true. Next slide. Because in some ways, it's about how these flows self-synchronize. If they're precisely in phase, then yeah, it's all going to require the same buffer space. But what if they're out of phase? Well, oddly enough, it's going to only require half the requirement of buffer space. Next slide. So in some ways, we can do a lot better than this if we think about the problem we're solving without changing anything and just looking at the interaction of multiple flows. Oddly enough, you don't need anywhere near the memory you thought you needed in your router. You need that bandwidth delay product divided by the square root of the number of flows. If you're taking 100,000 flows across a switch, you only need 1/100th of that delay bandwidth product. This was actually quite an old result, 16 years old, but vendors are still selling you enormous amounts of memory that actually is just really adding to delay, not adding to performance. Next slide. So why do we actually have buffers? Why do we actually put packets in a holding room before sending them out on the wire? And there are two reasons. One is, of course, multiplexing n flows into one. If they all arrive at the same time, everyone else has to wait for the first one to go out, n into one. But there's another reason as well, and that is most hosts are incredibly ill-mannered, impolite. They burst, and that's the wrong thing. When you burst, some buffer in the network needs to splay that burst out and even it out and make you a more polite sender. What if you were more polite? Next slide. What if you rate paced? Well, if you rate paced and distributed the data over the entire round trip time interval, oddly enough, you make much less pressure on network buffers. And oddly enough, you can go faster. So sender pacing is a really good idea. Next slide. If we all paced, if we all were polite to each other and actually paced that information out, we'd actually find we hardly need any buffering at all because we wouldn't form standing queues. And the amount of buffer space we need is actually much the same as the log of the average flow window size. And as long as that is effectively spaced out, it's a really tiny number. Why is this important? Next slide. Because if we can change the demands on memory, we are winning. Oddly enough, silicon hasn't all gone at the same speed. Processors have gone a huge amount faster, but they've gone faster over the last 40 odd years because of parallelism, not because of fundamental increases in the clock speed. Memory is really just a clock speed problem. And oddly enough, over that same period, memory speeds have gone up by a factor of 10, really slowly. So when we've got these ultra-fast networks, we haven't got memory to keep up with it. Next slide. Why is that important? Because the chip. Because when we're designing a switching chip, we have to design the switch and we have to figure out how to do the memory for that switch. If it's on-chip memory, then it can be quite fast, but the chip size hasn't changed an awful lot. So on the chip, 16 meg to 64 meg, no more. Now, if you do, I'm going to go external memory, that's great. You can get gigs of memory. But now you've got an external memory interface, you've got a bus, you've got all kinds of tricks to make it go. But that also takes up chip space. And oddly enough, on a switching chip, you actually spend up to 60% of that real estate to do memory control. If you can reduce the memory and actually say, I'm only going to use a fraction of the memory of the delay bandwidth product, you can make switch chips which are awfully fast. Next slide. And by awfully fast, I mean, wow, 1.8 terabits of switching capacity. This is how you make silicon work as fast as optical. You make it work by having only 16 megs of memory on board on the chip. Interestingly, it even has in-band telemetry, but the key thing is it has no memory, almost none. How do you have a protocol that can use that? Next slide. So now the pressure in terms of Darwinistic pressure is to actually understand flow states as they relate to queues and memory buffers. Next slide. Because what you're trying to do is actually optimize at the point when the queue forms, that point at the left where the round trip time starts to increase because the queue is forming. Because at the receiver, once queues start to form, you're getting no more data delivered to the receiver. You're working at capacity. Now, all these loss-based congestion control points work at the other end, over at the right, when the disaster has happened, and not only have you filled your queue, but the signaling system has failed. Next slide. So how do you detect the onset of queuing? Well, one way is to get the network to tell you. Next slide. This is something that was developed in the 2000s. Sally Floyd's group did this. And the idea was developing on an idea from digital back in the late 90s, I think, maybe early 90s. Explicit congestion notification. When queues are forming, mark a packet. So the network marks the packet on the way over to the receiver. That mark is put back in the axe is sent back to the sender. I know when queues are forming. I can now go as fast as I can until I get that notification. Next slide. Now, there are many things about this that are good. It's a single bit, that's great, but everyone needs to be aware. Everyone needs to mark these bits and receive the bits. Apple experimented with putting those bits in. Hasn't been a success. Why not? Next slide. Because it's a bit like security systems. Security only marks what's good. And if everyone does it, then if it's not marked, it's bad. But if only half of you mark what's good and it's not marked, I actually don't know if it's bad or not. I have no information. So unless everyone does it, it doesn't really work. And that's the same with ECN. Partial adoption is a signal that says, meh, well, nice try, but useless, which is a lot about security too, but that's a different talk. Next slide. So we can't make the network do the marking for us. We have to do it ourselves. We need to detect the onset of delaying. Next slide. I told you the slides were fast. We could use a system that actually detects the onset of queuing, not by making massive adjustments in response to packet loss, but by making small adjustments continuously that detect the onset of queuing. So you're constantly pushing in going, did a queue form? Did a queue form? Did a queue form? Next slide. And this is the principle behind a protocol recently, well, not recently, it's about 6 years old now, developed inside Google called BBR, bandwidth delay. So what it does is it paces the sending packets, pacing is good, and it probes every 8th round trip type interval. And the way the probe works is increases the sending capacity by 25%, which is a pretty big increase for one round trip time. And then it decreases it by the same amount for the next round trip time to drain the queue. And it looks very carefully at the delay, the round trip time delay on that probe when it increased by 25%. If the delay didn't change, yahoo, we're in business. Increase the sending rate. Keep up at that 25% increase and do it again in 8 RTTs later. If we found a little bit of delay, whoops, we've actually managed to trigger queuing. Don't make any changes. Don't alter the path bandwidth estimate because of packet loss. Why not? Because packet loss is erratic. Ignore loss, just look at delay. Next slide. And so now, instead of having a sawtooth, we have an entirely different profile that we actually establish the fair and efficient sending rate, network capacity, by basically probing into the network queue in short, sharp bursts, which actually take very little buffer space. You can actually build gigabit networks with megabit buffers, and that's a fantastic result. Next slide. The problem is, of course, fairness. And when mammals and reptiles meet, one or the other has a problem. And when loss-based systems and delay-based systems compete, one or the other is going to have a problem. Fairness is an interesting question with BBR, because what it does is it doesn't back off with packet loss. It keeps the pressure up. And so when you put a single cubic session to compete in red with a single BBR session that comes along 20 seconds later in green over a 10 gig wire, about a 30 millisecond round trip delay, BBR just wins. BBR is much, much better attuned to actually running at network capacity with making minimal demands on memory. Cubic, the reptile, doesn't. It relies on massive memory buffers to work efficiently. When BBR comes along, it kind of dies. Next slide. So in some ways, what we're seeing is a classic environment for evolution, a classic environment of survival of the fittest. Because what we're seeing at the moment is in the zoo out there, there's an awful lot of TCP control protocols. And whether it's Cubic, Neurino, Leadback, I think Windows use Leadback, Fast, Akamai use Fast, or BBR, Google use BBR a lot. All of these TCP control protocols are actually pushing against each other and jostling. BBR is actually trying to do it quite differently from most of the others. It's not actually using loss as a signal. It's using this probe delay as a signal. In some ways, this rich environment of competing protocols actually forces us to consider what's fittest. There's also a whole bunch of traffic models, because in some ways, all those video streamers, all of these Windows Zoom sessions, all of this DNS, there's a huge amount of different bits of traffic. And of course, that's just part of the environment. And all those queue disciplines that you network operators use, all of you have picked your favorite one. The poor packet and the poor flow running across all of them is getting a huge mixed signal, because you can use red, weighted red, Codel, fair queuing, and all these kind of queuing disciplines. But of course, consider the end-to-end system. It treats all of those as damage, and tries to optimize its behavior in spite of what you're doing. And of course, it's not just a single wire. There are all kinds of wires and wirelesses. There's cellular, there's Wi-Fi. They all have loss characteristics, delay characteristics. And of course, none of you have figured out how much memory to put in your routers. Your vendors would like you to put in bucket loads because it's so expensive and their margins are great. But oddly enough, the chip designers are scratching their head going, oh my God, this is a real problem. Can't put that much memory on the chip. And of course, there is some ECN out there for what it's worth. Next slide. So what wins? Inside all of this, it's not just what I'm doing is fine, I'll keep on doing it. Because oddly enough, we are changing everything all the time. And if efficiency and fairness need to be put on scales, and it's either you can have one or you can have the other, I actually would favor efficiency, because an efficient protocol that makes astonishing use of the network and leaves nothing on the table is going to naturally win in this place, and everyone else will be using it too. So protocols that make minimal assumptions about the insanity of what vendors do inside the network, the insanity of what even operators do to try and control the network. If the protocol can work in spite of that, that's a protocol that's fittest. And my suspicion is that protocols that constantly use feedback, that regularly, every 8 RTTs or even more, probe into the network and try and sense the network, are going to be far more robust and actually alter the internet fundamentally and put up an entirely new model of the way we use communication systems than the protocols that rely on irregular car crashes. Packet loss is a disaster, and driving our networks from underutilized to disaster to underutilized to disaster is a hopeless way of running a network. It's a hopeless way of running a road system. It's a hopeless way of running any of these systems. We need to change to make the internet run faster, run more efficiently. And the issue is right now, it's not the network anymore. Putting tricks, putting facilities, putting services inside the network infrastructure only makes life worse. If we actually did less in the network, less memory, less packet mangling, less state, less overhead, and pushed the entire problem back into end systems, we'd actually have a better network. And interestingly enough, that's where we're going. This is not just operating systems anymore. Most applications have given up on their platforms. Quick is a classic. Quick, the internet sort of system used inside Google's Chrome browser, has lifted the transport session up into the application. All the operating system sees is a bunch of UDP packets. They happen to have an encrypted payload, so all the network sees is nothing. Applications are now doing their own thing. Applications understand their own flow. There's enough space inside everything, including this little device here, to actually do an astonishingly sophisticated effort at managing the flow as an application. So what we're actually seeing inside this protocol Darwinism is not just a change in TCP. That's a minor thing. What we're seeing is a far more major change where the network is being relegated, where the operating system platform is being relegated, where the application itself is asserting a degree of ascendancy that is now, if you will, the major player in this network that we're seeing. This is now an application level network where the network protocols themselves are up in user space and actually making far better use of the network than anything we've ever done before in the platform. So in some ways, this protocol Darwinism is incredibly fundamental to the argument of what is the internet today. And if you think it was a bunch of networks interacting with a bunch of operating systems, with a bunch of dumb applications streaming across it, that was true in the 1980s. It's not true today. It's almost the opposite, that the application itself is now the master inside all of this. I think that's the last slide. Next slide, let's see. So what do we learn from this? First thing, rules of thumb are rubbish. Rules of thumb say, God, I don't know why. I'm just going to do it because everyone else has done it. That's crazy. We don't know that much about how to make extremely high-speed systems work. And over-equipping your router with memory is a really dumb thing to do, but everyone does it because it's a rule of thumb. Why? A cherished assumption, but it's wrong. If we really want to make a terabit network and even a petabit network sing and dance and do phenomenal things, we need to think differently. We need to continuously challenge our assumptions. And the beauty of all this is that the state of the internet tomorrow is not the state today. That the internet still has an extraordinary set of really important problems. And if we just operate our network and react, we're not going to meet those problems and we're not going to make it better. We're just reacting. If we want to move ahead, we actually need to treat the network as a malleable thing and treat the ecosystem in the same way that biology treats its own ecosystem, as an environment where adaptation wins, where changes actually create disturbances that in turn create efficiencies and opportunities to exploit. And so the beauty of this is there's a lot to learn about the internet, and I think we can all have a lot of fun in learning it. Thank you very much. I'll hand it back.